The entire executive floor fell silent when Victoria Harrison raised her hand and pointed at the worn leather bag hanging from the shoulder of an ordinary man standing near the marble reception desk. Her voice cut through the music and the clinking of champagne glasses like a blade through silk. "Security search his bag," she said, and the words landed with the weight of a verdict rather than a request. Two men in dark suits moved toward him immediately, their footsteps echoing across the polished floor. Employees who had been laughing moments earlier turned to watch. Already smirking, already certain they were about to witness the unmasking of a thief or a con artist who had wandered into the wrong building on the wrong night. But the man did not run. He did not argue, did not raise his voice, did not so much as blink under the weight of 200 curious stares. He simply lowered the old leather bag from his shoulder, set it gently on the reception table as though it were something fragile and precious, and folded his hands in front of him to wait. There was a stillness to him that unsettled the crowd more than panic would have. A guilty man fidgets, a guilty man sweats. This man looked like someone standing at the edge of a memory, not the edge of arrest. Seconds later, the private elevator at the far end of the lobby chimed, and its doors slid open. Edward Harrison, the retired founder of Harrison Global, stepped out slowly, leaning lightly on a polished cane he rarely needed but always carried out of habit. His eyes moved across the crowd, searching for the source of the commotion, and then found the bag resting on the table. His face changed in an instant. The color drained from it, the way water drains from a cracked glass, and his cane nearly slipped from his grip. Victoria, his hand still hovering near the clasp of the bag, watched her father's reaction and felt something cold settle in her stomach. Whatever authority she had carried into that lobby a moment ago evaporated in the face of his expression. Her father, a man who had negotiated with hostile boards and outlasted 3 recessions without so much as loosening his tie, looked as though the floor had opened beneath him. Edward crossed the lobby faster than a man his age should have been able to move, his cane striking the marble in sharp, urgent taps. He reached the table and placed his own trembling hand over his daughter's, stopping her before she could lift the clasp. His voice, when it finally came, was barely above a whisper. Yet it carried to every corner of the silent room. "Victoria," he said, "if you open that bag, you are about to discover the biggest mistake our family has ever made." Nobody in that lobby moved. Nobody breathed. And somewhere behind the calm, patient eyes of the man in the worn suit, a truth 30 years old waited to be set free. The evening had begun like every other celebration Harrison Global had ever thrown. With excess dressed up as elegance, crystal chandeliers threw fractured light across a lobby transformed for the occasion, and a live quartet played somewhere near the fountain of imported marble that Victoria had commissioned 2 years earlier, at a cost few employees were ever allowed to know. Hundreds of guests moved through the space in tailored suits and designer gowns, their laughter rehearsed, their handshakes calculated. Every gesture, a small performance in a room built entirely for performance. It was the 30th anniversary of the company Edward Harrison had built from nothing, and every investor, journalist, and rival worth knowing had been invited to witness it. Daniel Brooks arrived on foot, having parked 3 blocks away because the valet line intimidated him more than the building itself. He wore a suit that had been tailored for him a decade earlier, its fabric slightly out of fashion but still clean, still pressed, still carrying the quiet dignity of a man who took care of what little he owned. Over his shoulder hung a leather bag so worn at the edges that the color had faded to a soft, uneven brown, its clasp tarnished, its strap patched once with careful stitching. He carried it the way other men carried briefcases worth more than his monthly income, as though its contents mattered more than anything else in the building. The young woman at the reception desk glanced at him twice before speaking, her eyes moving from his shoes to his bag and back again, calculating in the silent arithmetic reserved for people trained to sort guests by the cost of their clothing. "Can I help you, sir?" she asked, her tone polite but edged with suspicion. Daniel answered simply that he had an appointment with the chairman, with Edward Harrison himself, and that he had been asked to come this evening. The receptionist's eyebrows lifted slightly. Mr. Harrison had not mentioned any appointment to her, and men who claimed private meetings with the founder rarely turned out to be telling the truth. She asked him to wait near the reception area while she checked, and Daniel nodded without complaint, retreating a few steps to stand near a pillar where he would not block the flow of arriving guests. He did not check his phone. He did not pace. He simply stood, the old bag resting against his hip, watching the room the way a man watches a place he has thought about for a very long time but never actually seen. It was in that stillness that Victoria first noticed him. She had just stepped out of a side room after a brief call with an investor in Singapore, still adjusting the sleeve of her tailored blazer, when her gaze swept across the lobby and caught on the man standing alone by the pillar. Everything about him seemed slightly wrong for the room, from the outdated cut of his suit to the scuffed leather of his shoes, but it was the bag that drew her attention and held it. In a lobby filled with designer luggage and monogrammed clutches, that worn leather satchel looked like an intruder from another world entirely. Victoria had built her entire career on reading rooms in seconds, on identifying threats and opportunities before anyone else in the building even sensed them, and every instinct she trusted told her that this man did not belong here. She watched him for a long moment, waiting to see if he would approach someone, ask for directions, betray some sign of nervousness that would confirm her suspicion. He did none of those things. He simply stood, patient and composed, as though he had all the time in the world and nothing to prove to anyone in that glittering room. She crossed the lobby toward him with the deliberate, unhurried stride she used in boardrooms, when she wanted the other side to feel the weight of her approach before she ever spoke a word. Guests parted slightly to let her pass, murmuring greetings she barely acknowledged, her focus locked entirely on the stranger by the pillar. When she finally stopped in front of him, close enough that he had to look up slightly to meet her eyes, she folded her arms and studied him the way she studied a contract for hidden liabilities. "What are you doing here?" she asked, her voice cool and measured, carrying just enough authority to make it clear that the question was not idle curiosity. Daniel met her gaze steadily, without flinching, without the nervous stammer she expected from someone caught somewhere they should not be. "I am here to see Edward Harrison," he said simply. "I was told he would be here tonight." Victoria's eyes narrowed. Her father received hundreds of requests for meetings every month, most of them from strangers, hoping a personal connection might open doors that ordinary channels never would. Investors seeking capital, distant relatives seeking recognition, journalists seeking scandal, all of them eventually finding their way to a lobby just like this one, hoping proximity might succeed where formal requests had failed. She had seen this pattern too many times to count, and every instinct told her she was watching it unfold again now. "And what business could you possibly have with my father?" she asked, letting the word "my" land with quiet emphasis, a reminder of exactly whose territory he was standing in. "I have something that belongs to your family," Daniel answered, his hand resting lightly on the strap of his bag. "Something I was asked to deliver." Victoria almost laughed. She had heard every version of that line before, dressed up in different words but always chasing the same outcome. Always ending with a request for money, a plea for investment, a threat disguised as a favor. She had learned long ago that kindness shown to strangers claiming hidden connections to her family rarely ended anywhere good, and she was not about to let sentiment cloud her judgment in front of half the business world. Nearby, a cluster of employees who had drifted close enough to overhear began exchanging glances and whispered comments behind their glasses of champagne. "Another one looking for a handout," one of them murmured. "Just loud enough to carry. Probably wants us to invest in some idea that will never work," another added. And a ripple of quiet laughter followed. Daniel heard every word. He gave no sign that it touched him at all. Victoria's patience thinned with every passing second, sharpened by the whispers around her and the growing sense that this stranger was becoming a spectacle she could not afford on a night meant to showcase control and legacy. "I think it would be best if you left," she said, her tone final, the kind of sentence she used to end negotiations that had gone on too long. Daniel did not move. "I would prefer to wait for your father," he said quietly. "I gave someone my word, and I intend to keep it." Something in the calm certainty of his voice irritated her more than outright defiance would have. She had built an empire on the principle that composure was a tool wielded by the powerful, and to see it wielded so effortlessly by a stranger, in a worn suit, felt almost like an insult. "If you do not leave immediately," she said, her voice hardening, "I will have security escort you out." "I understand," Daniel replied, "but I am not leaving without seeing him." Victoria's jaw tightened. Around them, the murmurs had grown louder, guests now openly watching the confrontation unfold, some already reaching for their phones to capture whatever might happen next. She felt the eyes of the entire lobby pressing against her, felt the weight of 30 years of her father's reputation resting on how she handled this single, strange moment. And in that pressure, in that instinct, to reassert control before an audience of investors and rivals, she made the decision that would upend everything she thought she knew about her own family. She raised her hand, gestured toward the 2 security officers stationed near the entrance, and spoke the words that would echo through the company for months afterward. "Search his bag." The officers moved quickly, flanking Daniel on either side, their presence drawing every remaining eye in the lobby toward the unfolding scene. Guests abandoned their conversations entirely now, forming a loose circle at a respectful distance, phones rising, whispers sharpening into open commentary. Someone near the fountain said the word thief loud enough for it to carry, and the accusation rippled through the crowd like a spark finding dry grass. Daniel did not resist. He did not raise his voice or step back. He simply reached down, unhooked the strap from his shoulder with careful, unhurried hands, and set the bag on the polished reception table exactly as one of the officers instructed. His eyes never left Victoria's face, and there was something in his expression that was not fear, not anger, but a kind of quiet sorrow, as though he had hoped this evening would go differently but was not entirely surprised that it hadn't. Victoria stepped closer to the table, her hand hovering over the tarnished clasp, aware of every eye in the room watching her fingers. She told herself this was simply due diligence, simply the responsible action of a chief executive protecting her family's legacy from strangers with hidden agendas. She told herself the tightening in her chest was anticipation, not doubt. She reached for the clasp. That was the exact moment the private elevator chimed at the far end of the lobby. Edward Harrison stepped out slowly, dressed in a simple gray suit far less extravagant than anything worn by the guests, filling his own celebration, his cane tapping softly against the marble with each measured step. He had planned to make a quiet entrance, greet a few old friends, and slip onto the stage later for a brief, humble speech about 3 decades of hard work. Instead, his eyes landed on the small crowd gathered near the reception desk, and then on the worn leather bag sitting open beneath his daughter's hand, and every plan he had carried into that lobby dissolved instantly. He recognized the bag before he even registered the stitching on the strap, or the tarnished brass of the clasp. He recognized it the way a person recognizes a voice from childhood, instantly and completely, bypassing thought altogether and striking somewhere deeper. His breath caught. His cane faltered against the floor, and for one terrible moment, 30 years collapsed into a single instant, and Edward Harrison was no longer the celebrated founder of a global empire but a young man standing in a modest office, watching his closest friend walk away for the last time. "Don't open it," he shouted, his voice cracking with an urgency no one in that lobby had ever heard from him before. The crowd fell silent immediately, the word echoing off the marble and glass, and every head turned toward the old man crossing the lobby with startling speed for someone his age. Victoria froze, her hand still resting near the clasp, confusion replacing the certainty that had carried her this far. She had never once seen her father lose his composure in public, not during hostile takeovers, not during the financial crisis that nearly swallowed the company whole, not even at her own mother's funeral. Whatever this bag represented, it clearly reached somewhere far beyond ordinary concern. Edward reached the table and gently but firmly moved his daughter's hand away from the bag, his fingers trembling against hers. He looked at Daniel then, really looked at him, studying the shape of his jaw, the set of his shoulders, the calm patience in his eyes, and something in his expression shifted from alarm into something closer to recognition, and then grief. "You look just like him," Edward whispered, so quietly that only those closest could hear it. "You look exactly like him." Victoria glanced between her father and the stranger, the pieces of the evening no longer making sense in any order she could follow. "Dad," she said carefully. "Who is he? What is going on?" Edward did not answer immediately. His eyes remained fixed on Daniel, on the worn leather bag between them, on a piece of his own history he had believed lost for 30 years. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the exhausted weight of a man setting down something heavy he had carried alone for far too long. 30 years ago, he said, I had a partner, a friend closer to me than a brother. His name was James Brooks. And without him, none of this, he gestured weakly at the glittering lobby around them, would exist at all. The name meant nothing to Victoria. She had grown up hearing the story of Harrison Global as a tale of her father's singular brilliance, a self-made empire built through his vision alone, and the sudden introduction of a co-founder she had never once heard mentioned landed like a stone dropped into still water. Daniel stepped forward then, his voice steady despite the dozens of eyes still fixed on him. James Brooks was my father, he said. He passed away 8 years ago. Before he died, he made me promise that if I ever needed to, I would bring this bag to Edward Harrison, and only to him. Edward's hands shook as he reached for the bag, lifting it carefully as though it might dissolve at his touch. Inside, beneath a folded gray sweater that still smelled faintly of cedar and old paper, his fingers found an envelope, its edges yellowed with age, its seal made of red wax that had somehow remained unbroken across 3 decades. His own name was written across the front in handwriting he had not seen in 30 years, handwriting that belonged to a man he had once considered his closest friend in the world. I thought this letter was gone forever, Edward murmured, his voice barely audible over the hush that had fallen across the entire lobby. I thought I would never know what he truly wanted to tell me. He broke the seal with unsteady fingers, unfolded the single page inside, and began to read in silence, his lips moving faintly over words only he could see. The color drained further from his face with every line, and by the time he reached the bottom of the page, tears had gathered at the corners of his eyes, tears that a man who had spent 30 years perfecting a mask of composure had not shed in public for as long as anyone in that lobby could remember. Victoria stepped closer, unable to bear the silence any longer. Dad, please, tell me what it says. Edward lowered the letter slowly, his gaze moving from the page to Daniel and back again. And when he finally spoke, his voice carried the weight of a confession he had never expected to make in front of 200 witnesses. Your father did not abandon this company, Edward said, looking directly at Daniel. He saved it, and I let the entire world believe I had done it alone. The letter, Edward explained, his voice growing steadier as the initial shock gave way to the relief of finally speaking a truth he had buried for decades, had been written by James Brooks during the final week before he disappeared from the company records entirely. 30 years earlier, Harrison Global had not been the towering empire it was today, but a small, struggling firm teetering on the edge of collapse after a disastrous investment nearly wiped out every asset the 2 young founders had built together. Creditors had begun circling. Investors had begun withdrawing, and the company that would one day fill glittering lobbies with champagne and chandeliers had come within weeks of disappearing entirely. James Brooks, Edward continued, had discovered a way to save the company, but it required a sacrifice that would strip his own name from everything they had built. A rival firm had offered to absorb the failing assets and inject the capital needed to keep Harrison Global alive, but only on the condition that leadership be consolidated under a single founder, someone the market could trust, without the complication of a partnership already showing cracks under pressure. James had made the decision alone, in the middle of the night, without ever telling Edward the true terms of the agreement he was about to accept. He signed away his own stake, Edward said, his voice trembling with the memory. He told me he was leaving to start something new on his own, that he no longer believed in what we were building together. I was furious. I felt betrayed. I spent years thinking he had simply given up on me, on us, without ever knowing that his walking away was the very thing that kept this company standing. Victoria listened, her earlier certainty crumbling with every sentence, replaced by a slow, dawning horror at how completely she had misjudged the man standing calmly before her. The stranger she had accused, humiliated, and ordered searched in front of hundreds of witnesses was not a con artist chasing a handout. He was the son of the man whose sacrifice had made her entire life, her entire empire, possible in the first place. "I never knew the full truth until this letter," Edward said, folding the page gently as though it might crumble in his hands. "James asked me, in his own words, never to reveal the sacrifice unless his son one day brought this bag to me directly. He wanted no reward claimed in his name unless it came through the honesty of his own child, freely given, not extracted through lawyers or public pressure." Daniel's throat tightened as he listened to his father's words spoken aloud for the first time in his own presence. "Why did he never tell me any of this himself?" he asked quietly, more to himself than to anyone else in the lobby. Edward looked at him with something close to tenderness. "Perhaps he wanted you to know your own worth without carrying the weight of my company's history on your shoulders," he said. "Perhaps he simply wanted you to live an honest life, unburdened by a debt that was never yours to collect." Around them, the lobby remained utterly silent. Hundreds of guests who had come expecting champagne toasts and rehearsed speeches, now witnessing something none of them had prepared for, a family's buried history unraveling in real time beneath crystal chandeliers. Victoria realized, with a growing weight in her chest, that every assumption she had built her judgment upon that evening had been wrong from the very first moment she noticed the worn leather bag across the room. Edward turned to his daughter, his expression suddenly heavy with a different kind of question. "Victoria," he asked, "why did you order his bag searched? What did you see in him that made you so certain he meant harm?" Victoria opened her mouth to answer and found, for the first time in longer than she could remember, that she had no words ready. She looked at Daniel, at the calm patience that had never once wavered despite the humiliation she had subjected him to. And something in her chest twisted painfully. "I saw an old bag," she admitted quietly, "and I decided that meant he did not belong here." The confession hung in the air, heavier than any accusation that had been leveled against Daniel all evening. Somewhere in the crowd, a guest lowered their phone, suddenly aware that what they were filming was no longer scandal but something closer to shame. Edward studied his daughter for a long moment, his own disappointment plain on his face, though there was compassion buried beneath it too, the compassion of a father watching his child confront a mirror she had never wanted to look into. "Why did you wait so long to bring this to me?" Edward asked Daniel, his voice softer now, curiosity replacing shock. "My daughter told me you claimed to have this bag for some time. Why come now, on this night of all nights?" Daniel considered the question carefully before answering, choosing his words the way a man chooses stones to cross a river, testing each one before placing his full weight upon it. "My father made me promise something before he died," he said. "He told me never to use this letter, never to use his sacrifice, as a way to demand money or recognition from your family. He said the moment I did that, I would be betraying the very reason he made the sacrifice in the first place." Edward's eyes glistened again, the weight of his old friend's character settling over him like a familiar coat. "That sounds exactly like him," he murmured. "He told me to only bring the bag if I felt you truly needed to know the truth," Daniel continued. "Or if I ever found myself in a position where silence would cost me something I could not accept losing. Tonight, standing in this lobby, being accused of theft in front of strangers who assumed the worst simply because of how I was dressed, I understood that the moment had finally arrived, not because I wanted anything from your family, but because I refused to let the last thing associated with my father's memory be treated as evidence of a crime." Victoria flinched at the quiet accusation embedded in his answer. An accusation delivered without anger, without bitterness, simply as fact. She thought of every year she had spent building her reputation on decisiveness and control, every lesson she had absorbed about protecting the family legacy from outsiders, and realized with a sinking clarity that somewhere along the way, protection had curdled into something closer to prejudice. "For years," Daniel added, his voice quiet but unwavering, "I built my own life without ever touching this history. I worked as an accountant. I raised myself on my own effort, never once mentioning my father's connection to this company, because he taught me that a man's worth should never be measured by what he can extract from someone else's sacrifice. Tonight was the first time I ever felt that silence might cost me more than speaking the truth. Edward closed his eyes briefly, absorbing the full weight of what his old friend had raised. The character he had instilled in a son Edward himself had never known existed. When he opened them again, there was a new resolve in his expression, the same resolve that had once built an empire from nothing. "This ends tonight," Edward said, his voice regaining the authority that decades of leadership had carved into it. "The world will finally know the truth about James Brooks, and it will hear it from me. In this room, in front of everyone who came here to celebrate a legacy built on half the story." He turned toward the small stage, set up near the fountain, where a microphone stood waiting for the celebratory remarks he had planned to deliver about 30 years of growth and success. Instead, he walked toward it now, with a different purpose entirely, his cane tapping steadily against the marble, Daniel and Victoria following a few steps behind, the entire lobby parting silently to let them pass. The murmurs that had filled the room only minutes earlier faded into something closer to reverent anticipation as Edward Harrison climbed the 2 small steps onto the stage and took the microphone from its stand. He looked out over the crowd, over the champagne glasses now forgotten in hundreds of hands, over faces that had come expecting a routine anniversary speech and were about to receive something they would remember for the rest of their careers. 30 years ago, Edward began, his voice steady despite the emotion still visible in his eyes. "I told the world that I built this company alone. Tonight, I need to correct that story, because the truth has waited far too long to be told, and a good man's memory deserves better than the silence I allowed to surround it." He told them everything. He told them about James Brooks, about the small office where 2 young men had once bet everything they owned on an idea nobody else believed in. He told them about the collapse that nearly ended it all, about the sacrifice James had made in the dead of night to save a company that would one day bear only one name on its letterhead. He told them about the letter, about the bag, about the son who had carried his father's honesty into this very lobby only hours earlier and been met with suspicion instead of gratitude. The room remained utterly silent throughout, the kind of silence reserved for truths too large to interrupt. Several board members exchanged uneasy glances, aware that the foundation myth of the company they served was being rewritten in real time before an audience of investors and journalists who would carry every word out of that lobby by morning. A few guests lowered their heads, ashamed of the whispers they had contributed to earlier in the evening, whispers built entirely on the assumption that a worn suit and an old bag meant something shameful rather than something sacred. When Edward finished, he looked directly at Daniel, who stood near the base of the stage with the same quiet composure he had carried since the moment he first walked through the lobby doors. "This man's father gave up everything so that all of you could stand in this room tonight," Edward said, his voice thick with emotion. "And earlier this evening, we treated his son like a criminal for carrying that truth in an old leather bag. That failure belongs to all of us, myself included, for allowing this company's history to erase the very people who made it possible." A ripple of applause began somewhere near the back of the crowd, hesitant at first, and then spreading steadily until it filled the entire lobby, guests rising from where they stood, several openly wiping at their eyes. Board members who had smirked at Daniel less than an hour earlier now approached him with quiet, genuine apologies, their earlier certainty replaced by the particular shame of people who had judged too quickly and been proven catastrophically wrong. Victoria remained near the edge of the stage throughout her father's speech, watching Daniel absorb the sudden reversal of an entire room's opinion, with the same steady grace he had shown when that same room had turned against him. When the applause finally settled and the crowd began to disperse into smaller, quieter conversations, she found herself walking toward him, her earlier authority replaced by something far more vulnerable. "I owe you an apology," she said, stopping a respectful distance away. "And it needs to be a real one. Not the kind executives give when they are worried about their reputation." Daniel studied her for a moment before responding, no trace of triumph or resentment in his expression. Only the same steady patience that had carried him through the entire evening. "I appreciate that," he said. "I judged you the moment I saw you, Victoria continued, forcing herself to say the words plainly rather than softening them into something easier to bear. I looked at your bag and decided you did not belong in this building. And I never once asked myself if that judgment said more about me than it did about you. I have spent my entire career telling myself that decisiveness and control are the marks of a strong leader, and tonight I used those very qualities to humiliate a man who deserved nothing but respect. Daniel considered her words carefully. Everyone in this room made the same assumption tonight, he said. You simply happened to be the one standing closest when it mattered most. I do not think less of you for a single moment of misjudgment, especially one you are willing to admit to, so honestly. Victoria shook her head slightly. It was not a single moment, she admitted. It was a pattern I have followed for years, and tonight was simply the first time. It cost someone something I could actually see. Can you forgive me? She asked finally, the question smaller and more uncertain than anything she had said all evening, stripped entirely of the authority she usually carried into every conversation. Daniel offered her the faintest, gentlest smile, the first real warmth he had shown all night. Forgiveness is always easier than living with regret, he said quietly. I would rather you carry forward what you learned tonight than spend years apologizing for something that has already passed. Victoria felt something loosen in her chest at his words, a tightness she had not fully realized she was carrying until it began to ease. Before she could respond further, her father approached them both, leaning slightly on his cane, his expression carrying the calm clarity of a man who had finally set down a burden he had carried for 30 years. I owe you far more than an apology, Edward said to Daniel, his voice steady now, the earlier tremor replaced by quiet resolve. Your father built this company beside me with everything he had, and history erased his name entirely because I allowed convenience to outweigh honesty. I intend to correct that, starting tonight, and I would like to know what would mean the most to you. Daniel considered the offer for a long moment, the weight of it settling over him slowly. I do not want money, he said finally, and I do not want shares I have not earned through my own work. All I have ever wanted is for my father's name to be remembered accurately. For people to know that Harrison Global exists today because of what he gave up, not despite it. Edward nodded slowly, something like pride flickering across his weathered features. Then that is exactly what will happen, he said. Your father's name will be restored to this company's history, permanently, publicly, and without qualification. And I would be honored if you would also consider joining our board, not as a gesture of guilt, but because a man who kept a promise for 30 years without ever seeking reward is exactly the kind of judgment this company needs at its table. Daniel's composure wavered for the first time all evening, a flicker of genuine emotion crossing his face as the full weight of his father's vindication finally settled over him. He had carried this secret for years, had guarded his father's memory in silence through every ordinary day of his working life. And to hear it acknowledged so completely, so publicly, felt like setting down a weight he had not realized had grown so heavy. I would be honored, he said quietly. In the weeks that followed, the story of that evening spread quickly through every level of Harrison Global, though not through gossip or scandal, but through a quiet, deliberate correction of the record. Edward personally oversaw the update of the company's history displayed in the lobby, ensuring that James Brooks's name appeared beside his own on every plaque and every printed history, restored to its rightful place after 30 years of silence. A small ceremony was held to unveil the corrected memorial wall, attended by employees who had once whispered accusations and now stood quietly, respectfully, aware of the lesson the entire company had learned in a single unforgettable evening. Victoria changed too, though not in the dramatic, sweeping way that made for satisfying stories, but slowly, deliberately, in the small daily decisions that ultimately defined a person's character far more than any single dramatic gesture ever could. She began sitting in on interviews she once would have delegated entirely to junior staff, insisting on meeting candidates personally rather than relying solely on resumes and appearances. She started a mentorship initiative within the company aimed at employees from backgrounds the corporate world too often overlooked, remembering, every time she reviewed an application, the worn leather bag that had nearly cost an innocent man his dignity. Daniel settled into his new role gradually, splitting his time between his accounting work, which he refused to abandon entirely, and his responsibilities on the board, where his quiet, measured judgment quickly earned the respect of colleagues who had initially expected little from a man so unassuming. He never let the company's wealth change the simplicity he had built his life around, still wearing the same modest suits, still carrying himself with the same unhurried patience that had first caught Victoria's attention for entirely the wrong reasons. Victoria and Daniel found themselves crossing paths often in the months that followed, their conversations gradually shifting from formal board matters to something warmer, something built slowly on the foundation of mutual respect rather than the rushed intensity of infatuation. She invited him to coffee one afternoon, not as an executive extending a courtesy to a board member, but simply as a woman who had come to genuinely enjoy his company, his steady humor, the calm way he listened rather than waited to speak. He accepted, and neither of them treated the moment as anything more than what it was, two people slowly learning to trust each other after beginning their acquaintance in the worst possible way. The old leather bag itself found a permanent home in a small display case near the company's history wall, resting beside a printed copy of James Brooks's letter and a photograph from decades earlier, two young men in cheap suits, standing in front of a modest storefront office, grinning at a future neither of them could have fully imagined. Employees who passed the display often paused, reading the small plaque beside it. A simple sentence Edward had insisted on writing himself. "The most valuable things a person carries are rarely visible from the outside," the plaque read. "But they are always worth the patience to discover." Edward finally found peace in the years that followed, having fulfilled the last promise he owed his oldest friend, watching the truth take its rightful place after 3 decades of quiet burial. He spent more time with Daniel than he had ever expected to, treating him not merely as the son of a man he had once loved as a brother, but increasingly as a member of his own family, someone whose steady character reminded him daily of everything he had once admired in James Brooks. Daniel, for his part, finally released a weight he had carried since childhood, the quiet burden of guarding a secret his father had entrusted to him without ever knowing exactly when or how it would need to be revealed. He had kept his promise faithfully, had refused every temptation to use his father's sacrifice for personal gain, and in the end, his patience had been rewarded, not with wealth alone, but with something far more valuable, the restoration of a good man's name, and the slow, steady beginning of a relationship built on genuine respect rather than assumption. Victoria, more than anyone, emerged from that single evening transformed in ways that extended far beyond her professional decisions. She learned, in the most public and humbling way imaginable, that the instincts she had trusted for years, the quick judgments that had once felt like strength, were sometimes nothing more than fear dressed up as authority. She carried that lesson forward into every decision that followed, into every candidate she interviewed personally, into every stranger she chose to see clearly rather than dismiss at a glance. Years later, when new employees joined Harrison Global and asked about the small leather bag displayed so prominently near the lobby entrance, they were told the story in full. Not as a cautionary tale about judgment, though it certainly served as one, but as a testament to the quiet strength of a promise kept across 30 long years. They were told about a father who sacrificed everything without asking for recognition, about a son who honored that sacrifice without ever seeking reward, and about a company that finally learned, decades too late but not too late to matter, that the truest measure of worth has never depended on the condition of the bag a person carries, but on the honesty and integrity carried within. The company itself changed in quieter ways too, ways that never made headlines but shaped its culture for years afterward. New hiring guidelines discouraged snap judgments based on appearance, requiring managers to document the actual qualifications behind every rejection, rather than relying on vague impressions formed in a hallway or a lobby. Training sessions for the security staff now included the story of that evening as a case study, a reminder that vigilance and dignity were not opposites, that protecting a company never required humiliating the people who walked through its doors. Marcus Reed, who had led the search that night under Victoria's direct order, later admitted privately to colleagues that the memory of Daniel's calm, unresisting face had stayed with him longer than any security incident in his career, teaching him more about restraint than any training manual ever had. Linda Carter, who had watched the entire evening unfold from just behind Victoria's shoulder, became one of the loudest, quiet voices for the changes that followed, gently reminding her employer in the weeks after the anniversary that character rarely announced itself through appearance, and that the best decisions were the patient ones. Victoria came to rely on her counsel more heavily than before, valuing the perspective of someone who had watched her at her worst and still believed she was capable of becoming someone better. It was a small mercy, the kind that rebuilds a person from the inside, without anyone outside ever fully noticing the repair taking place. Edward, in the years that remained to him, spoke often of James Brooks, no longer as a painful memory locked away out of guilt, but as a source of quiet joy he could finally share openly. He told Daniel stories from the earliest days of the company, tales of two exhausted young men working through the night on plans scrawled across borrowed paper, arguing over strategy, and laughing over mistakes that had once felt catastrophic and now sounded almost sweet with distance. Daniel absorbed every story hungrily, filling in the outline of a father he had known intimately as a parent but only now was beginning to understand as a young man once full of ambition and hope. There were difficult days, too. Moments when the weight of everything nearly buried came rushing back unexpectedly. A signature on an old document, a photograph discovered in a forgotten drawer, a mention of James's name in an old newspaper clipping that had somehow survived decades of archives. Edward faced these moments with Daniel beside him now, no longer carrying the grief alone, and something in that shared mourning seemed to ease a burden that had calcified in his chest for far longer than either of them had realized. Victoria watched her father soften in ways she had never witnessed before, watched years of guarded composure give way to something gentler, more open, more willing to admit fault without treating it as weakness. She found herself learning from that transformation, as much as from her own mistakes, understanding slowly that leadership built on fear of appearing wrong was far more fragile than leadership built on the willingness to correct course when correction was warranted. It was a lesson she carried into every boardroom afterward, one that quietly reshaped the culture of an entire company from the top down. Daniel never let the recognition change the fundamental rhythm of his life. He kept his modest apartment for far longer than anyone expected, kept walking to the coffee shop on the corner where the owner still called him by name and never once mentioned his connection to Harrison Global, kept the same quiet habits that had carried him through years of careful, anonymous living. When friends occasionally teased him about his sudden proximity to wealth and influence, he would simply smile and say that a promise kept quietly for 30 years was worth more to him than anything a boardroom title could offer, and that he intended to remain the same man his father had raised regardless of what the company records now said about his family name. And somewhere in that quiet, corrected history, in the space between an old letter and a restored name, Victoria Harrison and Daniel Brooks continued building something neither of them had expected to find that evening, not through grand declarations or hurried romance, but through the slow, steady trust of two people who had learned, in the hardest way possible, exactly what it meant to truly see another person before judging them at all. Their bond grew gradually across long dinners and quiet weekend walks, across boardroom debates that ended in laughter rather than tension, across the simple accumulation of ordinary days that mattered more than any single dramatic gesture ever could. Neither of them rushed toward a label for what they had become to each other, content instead to let it unfold at its own honest pace, the same patient pace that had carried a worn leather bag safely across 3 decades and finally delivered it exactly where it was always meant to go.